By sunrise in 1930, somewhere in Riverside County, California, the dog came back crawling. Belly dragging low in the dust, front paws pulling him forward, hind legs slack behind him like they'd forgotten how to work, tail tucked so tight it pressed flat against his belly. Dieter was a German shepherd, 3 years old, 60 pounds, steady and sharp-eyed, the kind of dog the foreman trusted to patrol the Valencia rows alone while the pickers slept in the bunkhouse, and the fog still hung between the windbreak pines. He'd gone out that morning before 5, disappeared into the gap between row 12 and the access road, nose low, moving fast, like he'd caught the scent of something worth chasing. When he came back at noon, he wouldn't stand. He crawled the last 50 yards across open ground, whining soft in his throat, and collapsed under the porch steps of the foreman's house. His fur along the spine felt wrong under the hand, singed, brittle, cracked when you pressed it, though no fire had burned anywhere in the grove. And his tag, the brass one stamped with his name and the ranch brand, wasn't on his collar anymore. They found it hours later, sitting perfectly upright on a nail head driven into the end post of row 12. The metal was warm to the touch. The air around it was cool. The sun hadn't been on that post all morning. The ranch sat east of the Santa Ana corridor and west of the desert floor, in the low country where the soil still held moisture if you worked it close and didn't let the wind strip it dry. The grove ran 30 rows deep, each row a quarter-mile long, with Valencias planted in tight lines and windbreak pines on the northern edge to block the cold air that slid down off the San Bernardino range on winter nights. In spring, the blossoms opened all at once and turned the air thick, sweet enough to coat the back of your throat. In summer, the ground between the trees stayed cool and shaded even when the sky went white with heat, and the wind died and the dust hung motionless over the access roads. Row 12 sat dead center in the grove, older trees, wide canopy, heavy fruit. The oranges there came in clean and large, but the pickers didn't like working it. They said the light under those branches never moved the way it should, that the dew stayed too long on the shaded side of the fruit even after the sun climbed past noon and burned the frost off everywhere else. One of them said it looked like breath on glass. Another said it felt like the trees were keeping something close. Dieter belonged to the foreman, a man named Kurtz who'd come down from a cattle ranch in Kern County 2 years before, and brought the dog with him. Kurtz lived in a white frame house with a porch and a pitched roof at the eastern edge of the property, close enough to the bunkhouse that he could hear if trouble started, far enough that his wife and daughter, 7 years old, small for her age, quiet, had space to keep chickens and a kitchen garden. The dog slept under the porch at night and walked the rows every morning before the bell rang, checking for coyote sign, checking for wind damage, checking the irrigation gates along the ditch that fed the grove from the main canal. He was a good dog, the kind that comes when you whistle, the kind you trust to work alone. Until that morning, he always had. The pickers saw him go. It was still dark, maybe 10 minutes before 5, and a few of the men were already awake, sitting outside the bunkhouse on overturned crates with tin cups of coffee, waiting for the bell. One of them, a man named Esteban, who'd worked the grove for 6 seasons and knew the dogs and the layout and the temper of the soil, said later he saw Dieter trot past the pump house and cut toward the windbreak gap at the north end of row 12. He said the dog moved fast, head down, tail stiff, the way a dog moves when it's locked onto something. No bark, no sound at all. Esteban watched him disappear between the trees, finished his coffee, and went inside to pull on his boots. By the time the bell rang at 6 and the crew filed out into the rows with their ladders and canvas sacks, Dieter was back. But wrong. He crawled the last stretch of open ground from the windbreak to the porch on his belly, paws scraping the dirt, head low, whining. Kurtz heard him and came down the steps in his undershirt, barefoot, and knelt beside the dog in the dust. Dieter wouldn't look at him. His eyes tracked sideways, fixed on something past Kurtz's shoulder, and when Kurtz tried to lift his head, the dog flinched and pulled away. Kurtz ran his hand down the dog's back and felt the fur crack under his palm, stiff, scorched, brittle along the ridge of the spine like it had been held too close to a flame. He checked the dog's legs, his chest, his belly. No blood, no wounds. just the burnt fur running in a narrow line from the base of the skull to the root of the tail. Kurtz lifted the collar and saw it loose. The buckle still fastened, but the tag gone. He called for his wife. She came out with a wet rag and a bowl of water and knelt beside them. The dog drank a little, then lay still. Kurtz stayed with him until the sun came up full and the air warmed and the dew burned off the grass. Then he stood, brushed the dust off his knees, and went to check row 12. They found the tag an hour later. Loopy, one of the pickers who worked the low branches and trimmed the suckers that grew wild at the base of the older trees, was clearing growth at the end post of row 12 when she saw it. The post was old cedar, gray and split down the center, and someone years before had driven a nail into it to hold a strand of wire that wasn't there anymore. The tag sat upright on the flat round head of the nail, balanced, perfectly still. She didn't touch it. She backed away and called for Kurtz. When he came, he reached down and picked it up barehanded. He dropped it 2 seconds later and swore. He said later it felt like he'd grabbed a horseshoe fresh from the forge. He wrapped it in the sleeve of his shirt, carried it back to the house, and set it on the kitchen table. His wife boiled a pot of water, dropped the tag in with a pair of tongs, and let it sit. When she pulled it out 10 minutes later, the brass was cold to the touch. It never warmed again. The crew worked row 12 that afternoon because Kurtz told them to, but nobody worked alone. They moved in pairs, one picker on the ladder, one on the ground, not talking much, not looking up into the canopy where the branches crossed and the light didn't quite reach. At one point halfway down the row, 2 of them stopped and stared up at a burlap sack hanging from a branch about 8 feet off the ground. The kind they used to haul damaged fruit to the compost pile. It was swaying, slow, side to side. There was no wind. The air sat thick and motionless, heavy with the smell of orange blossom, and underneath that something sharper, metallic, like the smell of a tool shed in summer. The sack swayed for 10 minutes while they stood and watched. Then it stopped. One of the men climbed the tree, pulled the sack down and opened it. Empty. Clean inside. It smelled faintly of smoke. By dusk, the wind machines wouldn't start. Kurtz checked the fuel lines, checked the spark plugs, checked the belts and the governors. Everything in order. He pulled the cord on the first machine 6 times. Nothing. He moved to the second machine and tried again. Same silence. One of the older men, gray-haired, who'd been on the ranch since before the war and didn't talk much, said quiet that it wasn't worth trying until someone walked row 12. Kurtz looked at him. The man shrugged. In pairs, he said. At dusk. Then they'll start. Kurtz didn't argue. He picked another man and the 2 of them walked the length of row 12 together, boots crunching dry leaves, not speaking, hands empty. When they came back, Kurtz pulled the cord on the first machine once. It started smooth. That night, Esteban was walking past the packing house, a long concrete-floored building with roll-up doors on both ends where they sorted and crated the fruit for the trucks, when he heard claws scrape across the floor inside. He stopped in the middle of the path and listened. The sound came again. Slow, deliberate, moving from the south end of the building toward the center, then stopping. The packing house was locked. Esteban had watched Kurtz lock it himself 2 hours before, dropping the bar across the inside of the door and clicking the padlock shut on the outside hasp. He stood there in the dark and listened. The scraping didn't come again. He walked back to the bunkhouse and lay on his cot, and didn't say anything until the next morning, when Kurtz came through the door and said the dog was gone. Dieter had been under the porch all evening, lying on his side, still low, still wrong. Kurtz's daughter brought him water in a tin pail just before bed and set it down beside him in the dirt. She knelt and touched his head, and the dog licked her hand once, slow, then closed his eyes. She went inside. By dawn, the dog was gone. The pail was still there, sitting in the same spot under the porch where she'd left it. The air that morning was cold, close to freezing in the low places where the fog pooled thick between the rows. But the outside of the pail was wet, slick with condensation, warm under the hand. Kurtz picked it up and felt the heat of the metal against his palm, like it had been sitting in the sun for hours or carried through fire and set down fast. The water inside was ice cold. After that, nobody worked row 12 alone. They'd work it in pairs in the morning. They'd work it in full daylight if the foreman asked, but once the sun started to drop and the shadows from the windbreak stretched long across the access road, nobody went near it. Someone, nobody admitted who, took a kerosene lantern and hung it from the end post where the tag had been, and every evening before sunset, someone lit it. The lantern burned all night, every night, and in the morning they'd find it still burning, glass clean, wick trimmed neat, oil topped off. Nobody ever saw who tended it. Men in Riverside County still won't say out loud, even now, what they think Dieter chased into the windbreak that morning, or why his tag sat warm on a nail in a grove where nothing had burned. But the rule held. You don't work row 12 alone. You don't walk it at dusk, and if you hear claws on concrete in a building you know is locked, you go the other way. The timeline didn't hold. That's what the men noticed first when they sat down together the day after Dieter disappeared and tried to piece together what had happened and when. Kurtz laid it out on paper, wrote down every sighting, every sound, every moment someone remembered seeing or hearing the dog between the time he left the porch that first morning and the time his water pail turned up warm under the porch 24 hours later. The numbers didn't line up. Esteban swore he saw Dieter trot past the pump house and disappear into the windbreak gap at 10 minutes before 5. Two other men sitting outside the bunkhouse said they heard a dog bark once, sharp, from somewhere north of row 12, maybe 15 minutes later. But Lupe, who'd been awake early to start the kitchen stove in the main house, said she saw a dog. She was sure it was Dieter. Standing motionless at the far end of row 12 at 5:30, just standing there in the gap between the trees, not moving, staring back toward the house. She said she watched him for a full minute, and then she looked down to adjust the damper on the stove, and when she looked up again, he was gone. Kurtz wrote it all down. He asked each of them again, slower. Esteban didn't change his story. He'd seen the dog go into the windbreak before 5. The two men outside the bunkhouse were certain about the bark. One sharp sound, far off, maybe 5:15. Lupe held firm too. She'd seen the dog at the end of row 12 at 5:30, standing perfectly still and then gone. Kurtz looked at the paper. If Esteban was right, and the dog had gone into the windbreak before 5, and if the bark came at 5:15, then Dieter should have been somewhere in the trees or beyond them when Lupe saw him standing at the far end of row 12 15 minutes later. But row 12 didn't touch the windbreak. It ran parallel, maybe 60 yards south. To get from the windbreak to the end of row 12, the dog would have had to cross open ground. Nobody saw him cross, and nobody heard him come back until noon, when he crawled out of the trees on his belly, already wrong. Maybe it wasn't him, one of the pickers said. Maybe she saw a coyote. Lupe shook her head. I know that dog. I've seen him every morning for 2 years. It was him. Kurtz folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. He didn't argue, but later that afternoon he walked the ground between the windbreak and row 12 himself, slow, looking for prints. The soil was soft in places, still damp from the last irrigation. He found boot prints from the crew. He found wheel ruts from the tractor. He found bird scratches and a few rabbit tracks near the ditch. He didn't find dog prints, not crossing from the windbreak toward row 12, not anywhere in that stretch of open ground. The search started that evening, once the work was done and the crew had eaten and the light was starting to fail. Kurtz didn't call it a search at first. He just asked a few of the men if they'd walk the windbreak with him, check the far side of the pines, see if maybe Dieter had gotten himself caught in the undergrowth or fallen into one of the old irrigation culverts that ran along the northern property line. 6 men went with him. They carried kerosene lanterns and long sticks for beating back the brush, and they spread out in a loose line and walked north from the grove into the pines. The windbreak was dense, planted 15 years before in double rows to block the wind, and the ground underneath was thick with fallen needles and dry grass and the kind of low, thorny scrub that grows where the light can't quite reach. They walked it for an hour, calling the dog's name, listening. Nothing came back, no movement in the brush. No sound except their own boots crunching through the undergrowth and the faint hiss of the lanterns. They found the first strange thing just before full dark. One of the men, a younger picker named Thomas, maybe 20 years old, who'd only been on the ranch since the previous autumn, stopped and pointed at the ground. There were tracks, dog tracks, clear in a patch of soft dirt between two pine roots. 4 prints, evenly spaced, heading north into the thicker scrub. Kurtz knelt and looked. The prints were fresh, deep enough that the edges hadn't crumbled yet. He stood and motioned for the others to follow, and they pushed forward into the scrub, following the line of prints. 30 yards in, the prints stopped. Just stopped. The ground ahead was soft, clear, undisturbed. No prints leading away, no prints circling back. Kurtz held the lantern low and checked the ground in every direction. Nothing. One of the men said maybe the dog had jumped from that spot onto harder ground. But the nearest hard ground was 10 feet away, and the prints didn't show any gather or push in the hind paws, nothing that looked like a dog preparing to leap. They just ended. They kept searching. They walked the windbreak north to the property line, then turned and walked it south back toward the grove, checking every gap, every low place, every thicket dense enough to hide a dog. Halfway back, 2 of the dogs the men had brought from the bunkhouse, mutts used to running the property and chasing rabbits out of the vegetable plots, stopped dead. Both at once. They sat down hard, ears flat, and refused to move. Kurtz pulled on the lead. One of the dogs whined and pulled back, digging its claws into the dirt. The other lay down and wouldn't lift its head. The men stood there in the dark, lanterns swinging, and looked at each other. Nobody said anything. Kurtz tied the dogs to a pine trunk and told 2 of the men to stay with them. The rest pushed forward. 50 yards farther on, they found a piece of cloth tied to a low branch, a strip of white cotton, knotted tight, the kind the crew used to mark rows during pruning season. Kurtz stopped. "Any of you tie this here?" he asked. The men shook their heads. Nobody had been this far into the windbreak in weeks. Nobody had reason to mark it. Kurtz untied the cloth and held it up to the lantern light. It was clean, unstained. It smelled faintly of kerosene. They walked back to the grove and split up, some heading to the bunkhouse, some back to the foreman's house. Kurtz stood on the porch and looked north toward the dark line of the windbreak, and his wife came out and stood beside him. "You'll find him," she said. Kurtz didn't answer. Inside, his daughter was already asleep. The tin pail still sat under the porch where they'd found it that morning. Dry now, cool to the touch. The next day, the search widened. Kurtz sent word to the neighboring ranches, and by mid-morning a dozen more men had arrived, some on foot, some on horseback, some driving trucks down the access road and parking in the yard behind the packing house. They organized into groups. One group to walk the grove itself, row by row, checking under the trees and along the irrigation ditches. Another group to sweep the open ground between the grove and the windbreak. A third to walk the canal road and check the culverts and the places where the water ran fast and deep. Kurtz walked with the group in the grove. They moved slowly, shoulder to shoulder, calling the dog's name, checking the ground for prints, for blood, for any sign that something had been dragged or carried. In row 12, they found nothing out of place except the smell. The same sharp metallic smell that had been there the day before, faint but present, like hot iron left too long in the sun. One of the men said it smelled like a blacksmith's forge. Another said it smelled like a lightning strike. They kept walking. By noon, the group searching the windbreak came back and reported they'd found 2 more cloth strips tied to branches. Both clean, both white. Neither one marked or stained. Nobody admitted tying them. Kurtz walked out to see for himself. The strips were tied at shoulder height, maybe 100 yards apart, both on the south-facing side of the pines where the light came through. He asked again if anyone had been marking the trees. Nobody had. He left the strips where they were and told the men to check them again the next morning, see if anything had changed. That night, one of the men sleeping in the bunkhouse woke to the sound of scratching at the door. Slow, deliberate, like claws on wood. He sat up and listened. The scratching came again, low, rhythmic, then stopped. He got out of bed, crossed the room, and opened the door. Nothing outside, no dog, no movement, just the dark and the faint glow of the lantern still burning at the end of row 12, small and steady in the distance. He stood there for a full minute, listening. The scratching didn't come again. He closed the door, went back to bed, and lay awake until the bell rang at dawn. By the third day, the older men started talking differently. Not loud, not in front of Kurtz or his family, but quietly, in the bunkhouse after the lanterns were out, or in the shade behind the packing house while the crew ate lunch. One of them, a man who'd worked citrus groves up and down the valley since before the turn of the century, said it plain. "You don't chase what you can't see," he said. "Not past the windbreak. Not in this ground." Another man, younger, asked what he meant. The older man shook his head. "I mean the old rows remember things. I mean row 12 ain't been right since they planted it. And anybody who's worked here more than a season knows it. You don't work it alone. You don't turn your back on it. And if a dog goes into that windbreak chasing something and comes back singed with no fire anywhere, you don't go looking for what burned him." The younger man didn't argue. Nobody did. That evening, after the work was done and the sun had dropped below the hills and the air had cooled and the dew was just starting to settle on the fruit, Kurtz stood at the end of row 12 and stared into the gap between the trees. The lantern hung above him, already lit, glass clean, flame steady. He reached up and touched the post where the tag had been. The wood was cool. He turned and walked back toward the house. Behind him, from somewhere deep in the windbreak, a sound came. 2 notes low and sharp like a dog whistle. He stopped and turned. The sound didn't come again. He stood there for a long time listening, then walked on. Inside the house, his daughter asked if they'd found Dieter yet. Kurt said no. She asked if they would. He didn't answer. The older hands in Riverside County told the younger ones after that, "You don't walk row 12 alone. Not before sunrise. Not after dusk. You don't answer if you hear something call from the windbreak. And you don't ask too loud what really walked that ground in the spring of 1930, because the people who were there don't like to say it, and the ones who weren't there wouldn't believe it anyway." By the end of the first week, the search had become something else, not a rescue anymore, not even a recovery. It was a ritual, repeated each morning and each evening, carried out with the kind of grim precision people use when they know the outcome won't change, but can't stop themselves from trying. The men walked the same ground they'd walked the day before, marked the same fence posts, checked the same culverts and ditches and low places where water pooled after rain. They moved in pairs now, always in pairs, nobody wandering off alone, nobody cutting through row 12 to save time. The crew had grown to include men from 3 neighboring ranches, and on Sunday a priest from the parish in town drove out in a Ford truck and walked the windbreak with them, blessing the ground as he went, his voice low and steady, the words barely audible over the wind that had started to blow again from the north. Kurt stopped sleeping. His wife said he'd lie down for an hour, maybe 2, then get up and stand on the porch, staring out toward row 12, toward the lantern that burned every night at the end post. His daughter stopped asking about the dog. She'd come home from school and sit on the porch steps with her hands folded in her lap, not talking, just sitting. One afternoon she found a stick in the yard and started digging a small hole near the garden fence. Her mother asked what she was doing. The girl said she was making a place for Dieter, in case he came back and needed somewhere to rest. Her mother didn't correct her. She brought out a tin cup of water and set it beside the hole, and the girl patted the dirt smooth and went inside. On the 9th day they found the collar, not in the windbreak, not in row 12, in the packing house lying in the center of the concrete floor, directly under the long wooden beam that ran the length of the ceiling and held the pulleys for the sorting lines. One of the pickers, a woman named Rosa, who'd been sorting fruit since dawn, saw it first when she came back from the outhouse just after noon. She stopped in the doorway and stared. The collar sat in the middle of the floor, leather side up, buckle fastened, as if it had been carefully placed there and not dropped. She didn't go near it. She backed out of the building and called for Kurtz. When he arrived, he stood in the doorway for a long time, just looking. The packing house had been locked every night since the search began. He'd checked the lock himself each evening before going home. The roll-up doors on both ends were barred from the inside during the day when the crew was working, and nobody had been inside that morning except Rosa and two other women who'd been sorting since 6. Kurtz asked them if they'd seen anyone come in. They shook their heads. He asked if they'd heard anything, any sound, any movement. Nothing. He stepped inside, crossed the floor, and knelt beside the collar. He didn't touch it right away. He looked at it, studied the buckle, the stitching, the worn places where the leather had rubbed against the dog's neck for 3 years. It was Dieter's collar. No question. He reached down and picked it up. The leather was warm, not hot, like the tag had been, but warm, body warm, like it had just been taken off a living animal. Kurtz held it in both hands and felt the heat soak into his palms. He turned it over. The inside of the collar, the part that had rested against Dieter's fur, was clean. No dirt, no hair, no smell. He held it up to the light coming through the open door and saw that the leather had been oiled recently, rubbed smooth, cared for. He looked at Rosa. "When did you last see this floor?" he asked. She said she'd swept it herself an hour before after the first sorting run. The floor had been empty then. Clean, she was sure. Kurt stood and walked to the door, still holding the collar. The men who'd been working outside had gathered near the entrance, waiting. One of them, the older man who'd spoken the night before about row 12, looked at the collar and shook his head. "That wasn't there this morning," he said. Kurtz nodded. He knew. He folded the collar and slipped it into his jacket pocket, and the warmth of the leather pressed against his ribs for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, after the crew had gone back to the bunkhouse and the women had finished cleaning the sorting tables and the sun had dropped low enough that the shadows from the windbreak stretched all the way across the access road, Kurt sat on his porch with the collar in his lap and tried to make sense of the timeline again. Dieter had come back crawling at noon on the second day, collar loose, tag missing. The tag had been found warm on the nail head in row 12 an hour later. The dog had disappeared again by dawn on the third day. And now, 6 days later, the collar had appeared in the center of a locked building, warm, clean, oiled. As if someone had been taking care of it. As if someone had been holding it. Kurtz's wife came out and sat beside him. She looked at the collar, and then looked away. "Maybe he's trying to come home," she said quietly. Kurtz didn't answer. He didn't believe that. But he didn't know what else to believe. The crew started talking in the open after that. Not just the older men. Everyone. They sat together in the bunkhouse after supper and spoke in low voices about what they'd seen and what they'd heard and what they thought it meant. Some said Kurtz had enemies, men from another ranch who wanted to hurt him, scare him off the land, and they'd taken the dog and were playing tricks, moving things around to make it look like something worse. Others said the dog had gotten into the windbreak and found something there, a den, a nest, a hole that went down deep, and whatever lived in that hole had marked him, burned him, sent him back as a warning. A few said nothing at all, just sat and listened, and when someone asked what they thought, they shook their heads and looked at the floor. One of the women, older, who'd worked the groves since before the ranch changed hands, said it plain. "The ground past row 12 doesn't give things back the way it took them," she said. "It never has. My mother worked here when this land was still wild, before they cleared it and planted it. And she said even then people knew you didn't go into those trees alone. You didn't chase anything into that windbreak. You didn't follow sounds you couldn't see. And if something came back out, you didn't touch it barehanded." She looked around the room. "That dog came back wrong. The collar came back wrong. And if you think that's the last thing that's going to show up warm in a cold room, you're fooling yourself." Nobody argued. The next morning, 2 of the younger men asked Kurtz if they could work a different section of the grove, away from row 12. He didn't ask why. He reassigned them to the southern rows near the road, where the light was good, and the trees were young, and nothing strange had happened. By the end of the week, half the crew had moved away from the center rows. The work slowed. The fruit in row 12 hung heavy and ripe, but nobody wanted to pick it. On the 10th day, they found the second tag. Not in row 12. Not in the packing house. In the dirt, under the porch of the foreman's house, right beside the spot where the tin pail had been, where Dieter used to sleep. Kurtz's daughter found it. She was playing in the yard after school, digging in the soft dirt near the steps, when her hand hit metal. She pulled it out, brushed it off, and ran inside. "Daddy," she said, holding it up, "I found Dieter's tag." Kurtz took it from her hand and stared. The tag was identical to the first one. Same brass, same stamp, same ranch brand. But Dieter had only ever worn one tag. Kurtz had ordered it himself from a smith in town 3 years before, and he'd watched the man stamp the letters into the metal one at a time. There had never been a second tag. He turned it over in his hand. The metal was cool, clean. The edges sharp, like it had just been made. He looked at his daughter. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked. She pointed to the spot under the porch, just to the left of the steps. He knelt and dug his fingers into the dirt where she'd been playing. The soil was soft, freshly turned, as if something had been buried there recently and then dug up. He sifted through the dirt and found nothing else. He stood, slipped the second tag into his pocket beside the collar, and told his daughter to go inside. She asked if it meant Dieter was coming home. He said he didn't know. That night, Kurtz laid both tags on the kitchen table side by side. His wife stood beside him and looked at them. They were identical, exact. Same weight, same size, same stampings. She picked up the first tag, the one they'd found warm on the nail head in row 12, and held it in one hand. Then she picked up the second tag, the one his daughter had found under the porch, and held it in the other. "They feel different," she said after a moment. Kurtz asked how. She shook her head. "I don't know. One of them feels heavier, or older, like it's been somewhere." She set them both down and stepped back. Kurtz stared at the tags for a long time, then gathered them up, wrapped them in a cloth, and put them in a wooden box in the back of the cupboard. He didn't want to look at them anymore. After that week, nobody in Riverside County rode the access road past Road 12 alone before dawn. Not then, not in the years that followed. The older hands told the new workers when they arrived for the harvest season, "You work Row 12 in pairs, you keep the lantern burning at the end post, and you don't ask questions about the dog or the tags or the warm collar that showed up in a locked building. You just follow the rules. And if you find something that shouldn't be there, something clean in a dirty place, something warm in a cold room, something that looks like it's been cared for when nobody's been caring for it, you leave it where it is, and you walk away. Because the land past the windbreak doesn't give things back whole. It gives them back wrong. And whatever came back in pieces that spring wasn't finished." The collar stayed in Kurtz's jacket pocket for 3 more days. On the 13th day, he took it out to check it one last time before putting it away with the tags. The leather was cold, stiff, and when he unfolded it, he saw that the inside of the collar, the part that had been clean and oiled when he found it, was now matted with fur. Dark fur, coarse, singed at the tips. He dropped it on the table and backed away. His wife came into the room and saw it lying there. She didn't ask. She just wrapped it in newspaper, carried it outside, and buried it in the garden, deep where the chickens wouldn't scratch it up. Neither of them spoke about it again. The search ended after 2 weeks, not because they found the dog, but because there was nowhere left to look. The crew had walked every row, swept every irrigation ditch, combed through the windbreak twice, dragged hooks through the culverts, and checked the packing house and the sheds and the tool house and every building on the property. Kurtz kept a few men working row 12 for another week, picking the fruit that had gone overripe while the crew avoided it. But even he stopped going out there alone. By the end of the month, the lantern at the end post had burned through 3 full cans of kerosene, and nobody admitted to refilling it, but every morning it was still lit, glass clean, flame steady, as if someone was tending it in the hours between dusk and dawn when no one was watching. Kurtz's daughter stopped digging the hole in the yard. She filled it in herself one afternoon, patted the dirt smooth, and went inside without saying anything. She stopped asking about Dieter. She stopped playing near the porch. At night, she asked her mother if she could sleep with the lamp on, and her mother said yes. Kurtz noticed, but didn't say anything. He'd started locking the doors at night, front and back, and checking the windows before bed, even though nothing in 30 years of living on ranch land had ever made him lock a door before. By summer, 2 of the pickers had left for other work. They didn't give a reason. They just said they'd found a position closer to town and packed their things and walked down the access road one morning and didn't come back. Another man, one of the older hands who'd been on the ranch for a decade, asked Kurtz if he could move to a different section of the property, farther from the windbreak. Kurtz asked why. The man said his wife didn't like it, said she heard things at night, said the air near the northern edge of the grove felt wrong. Kurtz reassigned him. By the end of summer, 4 more families had left. The bunkhouse, which used to hold 20 workers during harvest season, was down to 12. The ranch began to change. Subtle things at first. Kurtz stopped assigning solo work in row 12. If someone needed to check the irrigation line or trim suckers or clear fallen branches, they went in pairs. Always in pairs. He didn't explain why, and nobody asked. The crew understood. The older workers taught the newer ones without being told. You don't work that row alone, you don't go past the windbreak unless you're with someone else, and you don't answer if you hear something call your name from the trees. Those rules became routine. They weren't written down. They didn't need to be. They were learned the same way you learn not to touch a hot stove. Once, with enough weight behind it, and the lesson sticks. In the autumn of 1931, a year and a half after Dieter disappeared, a new worker arrived from a ranch in the San Joaquin Valley. Young man, maybe 22, strong, eager. On his 3rd day, he asked why nobody was picking row 12. One of the older women told him it was cursed ground, that a dog had gone into the windbreak and come back wrong, and after that things appeared where they shouldn't, and the crew had learned not to push it. The young man laughed. He said he didn't believe in curses. That afternoon, he walked row 12 alone just to prove he could. He made it halfway down the row before he stopped. Later, he told the foreman he'd felt something behind him, something close, like breath on the back of his neck. He'd turned around and seen nothing, but the feeling didn't leave. He finished the row at a jog and didn't go back. A week later, he asked to be moved to a different ranch. Kurtz didn't try to keep him. By 1935, the rules around row 12 had spread beyond the ranch. Workers at neighboring groves had heard the story, and some of them had started applying the same rules to their own properties, working in pairs near windbreaks, avoiding certain rows at dusk, lighting lanterns at fence lines. It became part of the culture in Riverside County, something everyone knew but nobody explained to outsiders. If you worked the citrus groves in that part of California, you learned the rules. You learned them fast. Kurtz's daughter grew up and moved away. She married a man from town and settled in a house near the coast, far from the groves. She never came back to visit. Kurtz's wife said the girl still woke sometimes in the middle of the night and checked the windows, checked the doors, even though she'd been gone from the ranch for years. She said the girl told her once that she still heard scratching sometimes, faint, like claws on wood, and when she got up to check, there was never anything there. Kurtz stayed. He ran the ranch until 1943, when the war pulled most of the crew away and the work became too much for the men who were left. He sold the property to a corporate grower out of Los Angeles, packed up the house, and moved into town. Before he left, he walked out to row 12 one last time. The lantern was still there, hanging from the end post, unlit now, the glass cracked, the wick blackened. He reached up to take it down, then changed his mind. He left it hanging. Some things, he thought, you don't disturb. The new owners replanted row 12 in 1945. They tore out the old Valencias, graded the soil, and put in new stock, younger trees, different root systems. They hired a new crew and told them the land was clean, ready to work. The crew worked it for 2 weeks. Then one of them found a brass tag in the dirt at the base of a young tree, half buried, warm to the touch. He pulled it out, looked at it, and dropped it. By the end of the month, the new crew had learned the rules the old crew had followed. They worked row 12 in pairs. They didn't work it at dusk, and they didn't talk about what they found, or what they felt, or why the air in that part of the grove always smelled faintly of smoke even in winter, even when nothing was burning. In 1952, the ranch changed hands again. The new foreman, a man who'd grown up in the valley and knew the stories, walked the property on his first day and stopped when he reached row 12. The trees were young, healthy, heavy with fruit, but the ground underneath them felt wrong. He couldn't explain it. He just knew. That evening, he asked one of the older workers, a woman who'd been on the ranch since before the war, if there was anything he should know about the land. She told him about the dog. She told him about the tags. She told him about the collar that had appeared warm in a locked building, and the second tag that had come up from the dirt like it had been planted there. She told him the rules. He listened. The next day, he posted a notice in the bunkhouse. Row 12 to be worked in pairs only. No exceptions. The rules held. They held through the 50s, through the 60s, through the years when the ranch was subdivided and sold off in parcels, and the windbreak was cleared and the land was replanted with different crops. They held even when the people who remembered Dieter were gone, replaced by workers who'd never heard the name, who didn't know the story, who just knew that row 12, or the section of land that used to be row 12, was different, dangerous, wrong. The rules became instinct. You didn't question them. You followed them. In 1978, a school teacher in Riverside County was writing a local history project with her students and came across a mention of the ranch in an old newspaper clipping. The article was brief, 3 paragraphs, dated April 1930. It described a missing dog, a search, and the strange circumstances surrounding the disappearance. The teacher tracked down one of the families who'd worked the ranch during that time. The man she spoke to, elderly now, his hands gnarled from decades of picking, confirmed the story. He told her about the tags. He told her about the collar. He told her about the rules. She asked if he thought the dog had been killed, maybe by a coyote or a mountain lion. He shook his head. If it was an animal, he said, we would have found blood. We would have found something. She asked what he thought had happened. He looked away. I think something took him, he said, and I think it tried to give him back, piece by piece, but not the way he left. The teacher wrote up the story for her class, kept it local, didn't publish it. But word spread. People in Riverside County still talk about it, quietly, carefully, the way you talk about something that might still be listening. They talk about the dog that came back crawling, about the tags that appeared warm in places they shouldn't have been, about the collar that grew fur after it was buried. They don't say it was a ghost. They don't say it was a demon. They don't say what it was, they just say it happened. And they follow the rules. In 2003, the land where the ranch used to be was sold to a developer. The groves were cleared, the windbreak torn out, the soil graded flat for housing. The crew that did the work found a brass tag buried 3 feet down during the excavation. They pulled it out, looked at it, and one of them, a young man who'd grown up in the area and heard the stories, dropped it and backed away. They left it in the dirt and kept working. When they came back the next day, the tag was gone. Nobody admitted taking it. Nobody went looking for it. The houses went up on schedule. Families moved in. And within a year, 2 of the families closest to where row 12 used to run had moved out. They didn't give a reason. They just left. People in California still don't work alone near old Groveland, not in Riverside County, not if they know the history. Parents still tell their kids not to pick up brass tags if they find them in the dirt, not to touch anything that feels warm when it shouldn't be. Teachers still assign the local history project, and every few years a student comes across the story and asks their grandparents if it's true. The grandparents usually nod. They say it's true. They say it happened, and then they say the same thing the workers said in 1930. You don't chase what you can't see. You don't follow what calls from the trees. And if something comes back wrong, you don't try to fix it. You just stay away. Some say the dog was stolen, killed by someone with a grudge, and the tags and the collar were planted to scare Kurtz off the land. Some say the dog got into the windbreak and fell into an old mine shaft or a sinkhole, and everything that happened after was coincidence, trauma, people seeing patterns where there were none. But others say the tags were too warm. The collar grew fur. The pail sweated in cold air. The dog came back crawling, scorched, and then disappeared again without a trace. They say the ground past the windbreak took something that spring, and when it tried to give it gave it back in pieces. Wrong, marked, as if it didn't quite remember how to make a dog whole. Which version makes sense here? The human one, the natural one, or the impossible one nobody in California dares to say out loud? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.